I would like to open this up to the panel discussion where we can, all speakers may pose questions to each other. And I would like to encourage the viewers at home to also send in your questions. I'm aware Erik has left us now, but any questions you have for him, you can still post, because all the questions we cannot address now, we will be forwarding to the speakers. And we have a question coming in. Let me put on my glasses. This one is for Jacob. Would a different way to put your theory be space-time emerges within consciousness, in line with Donald Hoffman's notion of space-time being a dashboard or a headset?
Yeah,
that was one we had before. And,
yeah, but it's the one I should
coming back to
think about.
Yes.
Well, actually, the interesting thing about this idea about a qualia space is that I have not really defined whether all these qualia are tiny individual elements, just the qualia of blue that then combines with the qualia of something round making up a blue circle, or whether a fully integrated experience of a blue circle exists somewhere in that qualia space. Now, if the latter is true, then yes, you might say that normal space-time kind of emerges from this qualia space, because every point in that qualia space then contains information about how particles in actual space-time should be configured. Because in order to trigger a particular percept of a blue circle, particles within a real space should be organized in a very specific way, so that the tiny point in qualia space then contains or restricts how actual space-time should behave. So in that way, you could indeed say that then space-time, physical space-time, actually emerges from that qualia space. So yes, in that sense.
In that sense, yes. Okay, thank you. A second question from Michael, and he says this one is for Erik and Esmee, but I think Iain might want to speak to it too. Is emergence a form of pattern recognition? And the second question that he poses is what role does curiosity play in consciousness? And I think Iain in particular has addressed that already a little bit. Shall we start with the first? Is emergence a form of pattern recognition? Who wants to start? Jacob, what do you think?
Well, sorry. If is it a form of pattern recognition? Well, in a way, yes. Pattern recognition is, in Erik's terms, also information reduction. Mm-hmm. Well, of course, you are then still left with the question: who is recognizing what?
Yes, indeed. Iain, you wanted to say?
Well, I think that patterns can be perceived as emerging from data, of course. But it depends what one means by emergence. And it seems that some of the time we've been using emergence as a black box for something we don't understand at all. It's a bit like the magician having a hat and waving a wand and a rabbit comes out of it. It emerges from the hat. Yes, but how? And there are things that can be said to emerge because they are a further stage of a single coherent flowing process. And what has emerged can be accounted for by what has come before.
Yes.
But for A to be said to have emerged from B, there must be something about B, and only B, that accounts for all the properties of A. If there are completely new properties that have nothing to do with anything we can find in B, then what one is using emergence for is a kind of sleight of hand.
Yes.
It's a kind of illicit trick, because one's saying, oh, it emerges, without having really said anything except, I don't know what's going on here. Now that's very important when it comes to the idea of consciousness emerging from matter, because nobody has the slightest clue how something that has no consciousness at all can give rise to consciousness.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Esmee, did you want to say something about that?
Yes, I think it's interesting. Well, you have the word emergence and then recognition. I think it's interesting to see emergence as, what Iain also mentioned as the relational. And the recognition is then a separate part, like do you recognize the patterns? And that is the question of the observer, which I don't really know how that works in quantum physics, etc. But if you just, I would say emergence itself, without even the recognition part, is more about this flow of energy that creates order within matter, and then it maybe results in life and also in order like consciousness. And then the second question is, can you recognize this? So if you talk about this ship of Theseus, to me that is never really a paradox. It's like the same as the atoms in my body are also changing. It's just a higher order emergence of complexity that could be the sense of self, that maybe emerged to maintain the self, to remain a path of energy to flow through. So it's just a more complex pattern, but it's still some kind of a pattern that arises like this fractal in the foam of your bathtub. So if you talk about waves, you also don't question like, oh, but the water is changing all the time. There's just this energy that creates the shapes of the wave. So I would say it's a lot about the energy is the driver, is what creates the forms. And then the matter is changing. And then ultimately energy and matter are also related, but I'm not a physicist, so I will not say anything about that.
And one thing I noticed about all three your talks was that you're all talking about reality as a process in which we obviously play a part. And the question I have about that is that Jacob very explicitly places consciousness in the physical world as a new dimension. Would you, Iain and Esmee, and Jacob, you can speak to this too if you want to, say that we need a place where that awareness needs awareness as opposed to individual consciousness, not something complex that arises and becomes our egos and our conceptions of who we are, but a basic awareness as a possibility of being aware. Does that need to be embedded in the universe for these processes to arise? Esmee?
Who wants to go first?
Esmee's put up her finger, so I'm going to ask her.
Yes, that's a really good question. I think it's really good to also distinguish like what you're talking about. Like in the talk of Helene, it was really interesting to just focus on consciousness, like the ego and how that can extend through meditation. So you can kind of deconstruct consciousness in very specific human traits that you can do experiments with, right? That is very much about this hyper-specific individuality of consciousness. And then I think it's very interesting to talk about consciousness in sense of this larger awareness. And then I don't know, like for me, that could definitely be related to quantum mechanics at some level. But I could also really imagine, and I have absolutely no like knowledge about this, but I could imagine that it's just kind of the same. So you don't really need another parameter, but it's the energy and the consciousness is kind of the same thing. It's kind of this joy, it's the flow. And I mean, I do think it's interesting then because it's all related, because it's all part of each other. Like our consciousness is part of this, all the backgrounds, like the universal field. Of course, there will be quantum mechanical properties that permeate through that because that is what it's made of. So I wouldn't really see why you need another additional term or why matter would emerge out of consciousness or consciousness out of matter. To me, it's just the same thing. But that's maybe my right brain.
The underlying field, could that be aware, do you think? Could that be a property?
Well, I would say that's the energy, and that's maybe it's super interesting if you then think about the observer. So coming back to this previous question, the recognition, I don't know. I mean, that's a super fascinating, super unknown question, right? Like, is the awareness, is there an observer that affects what happens? And that's, I guess, something relational. I don't know, just my intuition is that you don't need to like separate them, that there is not separate awareness and then this energy, that it's just the same. And then if you start to think in dualisms where actually it's just the same thing we're talking about.
Yeah, that's the left hemisphere then. Iain, do you want to speak to this?
Well, yes, I mean, there were several rather different questions being raised. I thought the one you were originally raising was, is there an important kind of consciousness which is not as it were, of which we're not immediately aware at the time. And of course, most of consciousness is not something we are aware of.
Yeah.
It's been estimated by one research group that 99.44% of all that's going on in our minds is not currently conscious to us. You don't have to buy the accuracy to get the general drift.
Yeah.
All that we are being aware of, is a tiny part of all that we know and are attending to in different ways in our bodies and brains. So yes, very importantly, and in that area, I mean, it's not in any way inferior. The unconscious realm is able to do all kinds of things that we think we do with our consciousness, but actually does them probably better.
Yes.
And later our consciousness comes along and takes credit for the decisions, the fine discriminations, and so on. So there's that. But then there seemed to be another question about how consciousness and matter related, and in the broader universe, could a field be conscious? Well, my answer to that is yes, definitely, because I think that all that exists in consciousness, that consciousness is the stuff of the cosmos. Matter is a phase of consciousness. It's not a separate thing, any more than ice is separate from water. It's a phase of water. It's neither lesser nor more than water. It's not separate from water. It's a kind of water. And matter is a kind of consciousness for a time that has certain quite marked properties that are different from the way we normally think of consciousness.
Yes.
Just as, water is transparent and flows and all the rest, and ice is hard and opaque and can split your head open. So they're different, but they're part of the same ontology. So
Yes.
For me, the idea that the consciousness and matter have to be they must be distinguished. I argue strongly that they are distinguished, just as ice and water are, but they're not somehow, there should be no need to have to set the one against the other. And fields of energy is into convertible with matter, obviously. I mean, that's what E equals mc squared in a way tells us.
Yeah.
And so fields of energy are also aspects of consciousness. Consciousness has fields. And, so my answer to your question is yes.
Okay, clear. Thank you. I'm just going to ask Jacob if he wants to comment on this, Esmee, before I come back to you.
Yes, well, in a way, the idea I proposed with consciousness being an aspect of space-time basically leads you to a very similar conclusion. Any configuration of particles being either matter or energy, also has a specific position within this qualia space, indeed leading to the same conclusion that there must be a kind of conscious state in which, for example, my smartphone or an electric field is, but it's going to be radically different from what we experience, simply because the particles that make up me are in a very unique part of this qualia space.
Yes. Thank you. Esmee, did you
Can
want...
I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
So, can I ask Jacob a question? What concerns me about this is it could be made concrete in this way. Many decades ago, I was in love with somebody who lived 6,000 miles away. Where is that love in space-time?
Qualia space-time.
Yeah, so that
Yes,
love
what's
exists.
what's added to this to try and bring space and time into a completely non-spatial, non-temporal experience?
Well, the non-spatial, non-temporal experience is the thing that you need to add, because that's lacking from a physical description of the world. It's the specific thing that's lacking, the stuff that actually makes the world alive. So the idea I propose is, if you want to stick to a purely physicalist theory of consciousness, the only way you can actually introduce consciousness, well, introducing consciousness particles is not going to work. Stating that consciousness is something emergent is, like you very rightfully said, doing the same thing as saying it's magic. So the only thing within our present contemporary physical framework where you can add it in is, well, you have to plug it into sort of space-time. It's the only part where it logically fits. I'm not saying it's the right way, but it is a way that offers some possibilities. So to get back to your question, so where is the love between you and person 6,000 miles away? It is within that qualia space. It exists there, separate from normal space-time. It's not a material thing. It's the configuration.
So that's where I find that your concept of having to have these experiences somehow localized in space-time, unless what you mean by space-time is something quite different from space-time as normally understood, in which case the term space-time is no longer doing any work, it's no longer helpful. And my way of thinking is that rather than put consciousness in space-time, I would say space-time is a way in which we describe aspects of consciousness.
Yeah, I think that that I then did not explain properly the idea, because exactly what I'm meaning.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Good.
Yeah.
So we're in agreement. Esmee is trying to make a point, so let me go to you, Esmee.
Yes, maybe I'm referring a bit to the same thing then as Iain, but yeah, I wonder, maybe it's a question to both. And actually, this would be such a great question to ask Erik, so maybe we can ask him to reply to this. I just really wonder, I mean, if you just think about the standard model and this universal field, which is not empty, where you have these excitations of particles that annihilate each other, why would you then need, I mean, in the standard model, isn't it more about going deeper into this standard model, which is of course also a model? And is that what you're trying to do? Or isn't it just sort of part of it? Like within these quantum mechanics, you also kind of have an probability, and a particle can go up and down, and that is some kind of information. So isn't it, or to me, it just seems a bit the same, like this universal field, and talking about consciousness as this larger awareness, which is kind of this flow, which is part of who we are, what we are built up from as well. I mean, I wouldn't really see why you need to separate it and then say, okay, consciousness is something besides that kind of universal field that is kind of the whole, right?
Yeah, so basically what you're referring to is the zero-point field, and indeed there are some proposals that state that conscious experiences arise from this complex interactions within the zero-point field. So that would indeed be very much alike to what you were saying. Now the idea, and I would like to emphasize this, is that my theory or my thinking about consciousness as a separate dimension might sound extremely physicalist or reductionistic, but it's not really intended in that way. So the idea is basically coming from a very Cartesian reasoning in terms of, I know that conscious experiences exist because I have them. So they should fit in somewhere within our physical description of the world, and then just simply by means of deduction, the only way where you can leave them is you can describe them as a kind of additional dimension within qualia space. Now, there have been very nice mathematical descriptions of qualia space, but then you have to think about how do these qualia, these conscious perceptions, map onto where physical particles are in space. Now, this is basically where this idea comes from.
Jacob, we have a question from the audience that actually fits with this one quite nicely. Hans wants to know, he says he's very interested in your ideas about quantum mechanics, but doesn't your model need an explicit consciousness causes collapse kind of a step in it? Is there such a step? How do you...
Well, actually, yes and no. The interesting thing is, if you look at the consciousness causes collapse idea, that is indeed basically conscious. Quantum physics says particles have this wave-particle duality. You can actually do quite a bit of computations and then basically get to this idea of that a particle has a particular probability of being somewhere until you measure it, because then it's either there or not there. So a probability of 75% of finding a particle at a given location, if you then measure and you find it, then the probability all of a sudden is now 100%. Within this particular model, the interesting thing is that you can either say, okay, if something like that happens, then I have one particular conscious moment. But with that particular conscious moment, you have a series of potential physical realizations of that, which is actually very much like Everett's many worlds model, the idea that you have several different universes splitting off the moment that you consciously observe something. However, this relation between a position in this qualia space and a position in normal physical space-time, it goes both ways. So it could also be that with one particular realization of one particular point at space-time, you have a whole series of possible conscious interpretations. And there's actually also a model for that. That's Dieterze's many minds model. But there's also an alternative, and that is that you don't require an objective collapse model, but basically that you say, these qualia that I'm talking about, it's quite difficult to think about this in terms of actual fully realized consciousness. You could also say, and that's actually more the line of reasoning I'm thinking about, it's kind of a proto-consciousness. So there's a very nice philosophical model. It's Russell's pan-proto-psychism, basically that the basic constituents of consciousness are fundamental to the universe, and that you have to think of the universe as a kind of process, and that during each time moment, each tick of the clock, you get this coupling of the physical world with a particular mental aspect. And this mental aspect would then be the position on this consciousness dimension, and the physical aspect, where particles are in physical space-time. And the mechanism that could cause these kind of collapses, there are several proposals for objective collapse models. The Girardi-Rimini-Weber model is one. You could go for Penrose's objective reduction model. So there are different alternatives to this idea that you need a consciousness causes collapse interpretation.
Thank you. We have a different question, which is for Iain, from Johannes. And he says, could you please expand on your notion that the relation is prior and needs to be prior to the relator?
Could I expand on it? Is
Yes,
that the question?
That's the question.
Yes. Yes. Well, I despaired of finding physicists who would confirm this, but in recent years I found two, David Mermin and Pete Hood, who effectively state that relations are prior to relata. But from a philosophical point of view, it seems to me to be a rather important point, because it starts from the idea that there just are things that can be known out of context, but nothing is what it is except in a context. And if you change the context, you change the thing. And if you take it out of the context, it's no longer what it was when it was in the context. And this is one of the most important problems with modern Western philosophy. John Dewey said that the neglect of context was the greatest problem in analytic modern philosophy. And I would agree with that, because context is everything. Context changes the whole, because everything is connected and has effects on yes. other things. So before you can decide what a part is or a thing is, you need already to know what relationships it takes part in. And you may say, well, how can there be a relationship before there are parts? There's a lovely image which I think helps me, which is a Vedantic image known as Indra's net. And the idea is that the cosmos is covered by a net. And at every crossing point of the net, where the threads cross, there is a little jewel. And in each jewel, all the other jewels in this net are also reflected. So it brings in a number of ideas. But the reason I mention it here is that, in essence, the net is primary, the connections are the primary thing. And then what we identify once all these connections have been made is, oh, there's a thing, a crossing point. That stands out to my left hemisphere's attention as a detail. So there's a thing there. And so that's another way of putting it. It's a pity that Eric went, because I thought it was great that at last somebody was talking about the massive problem of the reduction of wholes to parts. And,
Yes.
That seems to be intrinsic to what we're talking about, that when you take a part, as you see it, out of a whole, not only have you changed the part, number one, but also you cannot now reconstruct the whole from those parts. You can extract something post factum and say, this element I'm going to call a part, but you can't make the whole effectively from the parts.
Yes.
Any more than you can make in a line. Once a line exists, you can make a point in it because you've imported extension. But what you can't do is make a line out of points, not even an infinite number of them, because a point has no extension. No. So prospectively it cannot be created. Retrospectively it can be found.
Yes. Thank you. All right, we have maybe time for maybe one or two more questions. We have one from Param, which is for Jacob. If a qualia consciousness dimension in the universe is plausible, why don't you just say that everything is made out of consciousness or qualia, rather than proposing a less parsimonious dualistic view that might reflect our dualistic perception and bias?
Yeah, it's a good question. So you could indeed argue for idealism in this particular way. The reason for me not doing that in this way is that I kind of came up with this particular idea as a kind of thought exercise for myself to see how far can you go with sort of contemporary models of physics. So the moment that you say or are going to say, well, it's completely based on this consciousness dimension, you kind of lose a possibility, or you lose the connection with sort of contemporary physical models. I think that is the main thing here. So rather than stating this model is correct, I think that it's far more an illustration of the kind of lengths that you have to go through if you want to fit consciousness in within sort of the normal physicalist view of the world. So yes, it fits in, but you have to go through these kinds of lengths. It's a kind of exercise showing that consciousness should either be fundamental or part of a kind of dualist framework if you want to fit it in within the physicalist framework.
Okay, so it's more of a thought experiment. So let me ask you, do you believe in this model? Or would you say you're more of an idealist at heart?
Model. No, well, the thing is, I kind of came up with this also as a kind of exercise. Can I come up with something that is, in theory, empirically verifiable? So I have a very strong interest in panpsychist models and panpsychist philosophies. The main problem, as for example Philip Goff also states, is that, well, it's very difficult to come up with a way to test these models. And this is actually the only way I could come up with a model which has some features which might be empirically verifiable, and in particular the aspect of one particular place in this consciousness space mapping on several places in physical space and vice versa. The idea that it's a probability distribution, that is something that you could in theory test, and it fits with the literature on anomalous phenomena, because this model very explicitly predicts that the relationship between the state of my brain and the state of my consciousness is a probabilistic one and not a fully deterministic one, which means that sometimes I experience things that are not in line with my normal physical relation of physical state of my brain.
Okay.
In other words, sometimes I experience weird things. Given that happens to 80% of the general population,
yep.
that kind of gives me some hopes.
Okay.
But no, Yeah, it's primarily an idea to come up with a variation on panpsychism that might be empirically verifiable.
Okay, so we have just 1 minute left, and I'm not really supposed to ask you any more questions, but I want to ask you one last thing, and I'm going to ask you to be very brief in your reflections on it, because on Tuesday we had a very lively and interesting discussion where we didn't agree on very many things, but the one thing we did agree on is that what we have completely overlooked in studying consciousness has been first-hand experience. We've gone about it in a much too third-hand manner. So my question to the three of you is, would you say that we need more first-hand experience, more first-person perspectives in thinking about consciousness? And I think you virtually answered that already, Jacob, so I'll start with you. If you can...
Well, yes, we do. I mean, even if I think about this qualia dimension, probably different laws act there, and that means that you might have laws of consciousness in a way. So yes, you absolutely need the first-person perspective.
Thank you. Esmee?
Yes, my very short answer is yes.
Okay, thank you. That's extremely short. Iain?
I have three answers: yes, yes, and yes.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for your contributions to both in forms of presentations and to the discussion. I'd like to thank the audience at home for watching and for posing such interesting questions. Again, if we didn't get to your question today, we will be posing them to the speakers offline, and they will hopefully reply by email. The talks today, as well as Tuesday's talks, will be available on the Essentia Foundation website. So if you want to see them again, or if you want to point other people to them, they'll be there. Thank you all very much for your time, and that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.